Wow, this is an exciting meeting. I am Dr. Sarah Williams, and I am the honored facilitator for Living Your Best Life, moving from pain to purpose after grief, stress, and/or trauma. I'm so excited that you have joined this unique webinar with the Empowering Her Power Circle. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this information. This is a recorded webinar, but it's great information, and there will be an opportunity at the end for you to interface with me if you have any questions. So let's get started. For the most part, I will be moving along and I will be talking gradually, um, specifically about each PowerPoint and highlighting certain information. Um, it is basically a combination of clinical and personal information. Just to introduce myself, I am a licensed clinical psychotherapist with the Commonwealth of Virginia. I own Covenant Way Clinical Counseling. I am also the creator and TV host of Dr. Sarah After Dark, which is a mental health awareness show that airs on Sky 4 TV on Sunday evenings, as well as the Now Network on Mondays at 5 p.m. I'm also a naval widow, a mother of twins, and I have definitely myself gone through different periods of my life where I experienced grief and trauma, and it was difficult for me to figure out how I wanted to move forward. So, to begin our webinar today, I wanted to start with a basic definition of grief defined, and that's the next slide. Grief is operationally defined as a deep sorrow, especially that's caused by someone's death, such as she was overcome with grief. It's associated with sorrow, misery, sadness, anguish, pain, distress, agony, torment, affliction, suffering, heartache, heartbreak, and what most of us can probably relate to is brokenheartedness. It is a heaviness in our heart, and it actually alters how we perceive life and how we are moving forward with life. And the next slide is like grieving is never easy. There's no easy way to move through grief. There's no way to skip steps. There's no way to push it and make it stop. Um, it is a process. Grieving is never easy. In many regards, we associate grieving with the passing of a loved one. But please know the focus of this webinar is to make sure we understand that grieving can also be associated with the coming of an end of a career, a relationship, a friendship, or a traumatic situation. Next slide. Grief is a process, as I mentioned before. Grief is a process, and it's multiple stages associated with grief. The first stage is denial. I can't believe this is happening to me. Whether it is the loss of a career, being downsized, being furloughed if you work for the government, being replaced by technology, being requested to relocate and you don't want to, um, having someone break up with you, or as we most relate to, is losing someone that we could not even imagine that something could have happened to them. And that is the denial stage when you're like, I can't believe this happened to me. The next phase or stage is isolation. And a lot of times when we're in the grieving process, we isolate ourselves. I just want to be alone. You feel different from society. You feel different from everybody else and from the rest of the world. And you literally just want to not be associated with anyone. The next phase is anger. When the thought is, it hits you and it upsets you, it's like, how could this happen to me? Um, why is this happening to me? Am I being punished? Have I done something wrong? If you lost someone through a traumatic experience, you may be very angry at the person that harmed the individual that you lost. or you're angry at the person that left. If it's grieving the loss of a job, then you could be angry because you feel like you shouldn't have been let go. That's a natural response to a loss. The next phase is bargaining. If only I had done things differently, or if they would have done something. Like if you bargain and you say, well, if I do really good in this aspect of my life, will it replace what I lost? Will that person come back to me? Will my marriage be reunited with the person? Somehow, if you bargain with life, that will ease the pain of the grief. And unfortunately, that's not the case. It's just a matter of processing and going through those grief stages. And you almost have to just get to a point where you understand that it's a natural part of life. Another stage is depression. It includes persistent sadness, anxious, and pessimistic. Sometimes having just a negative outlook overall, not really being accepting of that this was a natural progression. So depression is actually anger turned inward. So if you're no longer angry outside on external ways, then you may turn that anger inward and become very depressed and very sad. A lot of times, clinically, that's the time to get help. You see a therapist, see a certified grief counselor, definitely talk to your doctor. This is that point where you probably need to get some support. And if you progress through the stages of grief successfully, you get to a point of acceptance and you say, now I see this is why that had to happen. Or you have a level of gratitude for have known or loved the person and what they brought to your life. You find a way that say, I might have been downsized or fired or let go, but I found a new career, or I decided to retire and volunteer and I have more time now. I have more time to take care of myself. You basically find acceptance with the loss. However, when we don't progress through these stages successfully, we go through what's known as complicated grief. And complicated grief can result if the grief happened as a result of something extremely traumatic. For instance, domestic violence. If someone is a victim of domestic violence, they can actually grieve the normalcy of what a relationship should bring. If they were sexually abused or assaulted, the grief is differently because you grieve a loss of a sense of self. Definitely gun violence and mass shooting. I lost an older brother to gun violence, and the way that I grieved his death was a lot different than if he had died of natural causes. And it caused me to grieve differently. And I think I processed the stages of grief where I never really got to acceptance until I just went through a lot of time with therapy and began to understand that sometimes in life we don't have the answers as to why things happen. Terrorist attacks like September 11th. We grieve that we grieve the safety of our country. We grieve that we are no longer in a way of living and existing without threat. That's definitely a factor that contributes to traumatic grief. Incarceration. Individuals, they lose their freedom. Even if they committed a crime, it's a grieving process for them to recognize that this is now my life. My life is completely changed. I am now prison number XYZ227, and that's going to follow me now for the rest of my life. Vicarious victimization. What is that? That means that if you have observed someone being abused, assaulted, you've observed the mass shootings, you've observed a terrorist attack, you're related to someone that has been incarcerated, or they have been or you've observed someone else being a victim in some way, you can experience traumatic grief just from witnessing those episodes. Um, Being a victim of racial bias and hate crimes. I think that we're all, as Virginians, familiar with the cruel episode that happened in Charlottesville, and we can relate to that. We can relate to the tension that is currently in our country, and many of us, unfortunately, have been victims of racial bias, and some of us can relate to what someone goes through when they're a victim of a hate crime. There's a traumatic grief associated with that because it's not naturally as humans not to coexist. So when we have those types of hostility within what should be a natural way that we coexist with one another in this world, it creates a trauma, and that trauma is related to grief. Now, we look at chronic grief. Traumatic grief can definitely contribute to chronic grief. However, a natural grief can also become chronic grief. And what is chronic grief? Chronic grief happens when it lasts for prolonged periods of time, extended periods of time, meaning you were a victim and you have not been able to process it, you have not been able to move forward, and you continue to feel as if you are a victim, and you never really find a way to move forward. And with that, it just extends, and it's extended and for a long period of time. There does not seem to be any significant reduction in emotional distress. So the same feelings and emotions and harm and hurt and trauma you felt at the initial onset is what you still feel maybe even years later. It does not end or decrease in severity over time, and a person experiencing this continues to feel extreme distress. Chronic grief is definitely warranted for clinical therapy, mental health therapy. See a doctor or schedule an appointment with a mental health therapist, because chronic grief contributes to depression and anxiety or other mental health maladies that need medical attention. There are types of grief and reactions. There's a physical reaction to grief, such as a death. There's a social reaction, such as a divorce, and there's an occupational type of grief, which is a job. So these are the types of grief: physical, social, and occupational. The types of grief include physical, and that's when someone you know or love passes away. There's a type of grief associated with the social realm, where there was an end of a relationship, there's a divorce. Family ties, when there are a difficulty maintaining family ties, then that's a social type of grief. And then occupational type of grief, and that's when you lose your job, or you're transferred, or you're replaced, or you experience something on your job that requires you to have to quit and you don't want to. So the emotional reactions of grief can include anger, guilt, anxiety, sadness, and despair. And those are normal responses when we experience any of those types of grief. There are physical reactions of grief, and they can include difficulty sleeping, sleeping too much, or not being able to sleep at all, waking in the middle of the night, getting up extremely early, just sleeping, and changes in your sleeping pattern, changes in your appetite. And it can include overeating, or that can include not eating enough, not getting the proper nutrients, and what you do eat. Are you eating a lot of foods that have a high fat content or carbohydrates? Are you going through the drive-through instead of preparing a meal? Then there are physical problems, such as illness. And this is where we find the development of our chronic illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, um, and a lot of times our autoimmune disorders develop from a reaction to a type of grief, and now our body um, is affected, and our physical body is affected. The next slide is effects and its impact on you. Physically, as I just talked about, illness can include migraines, increase in loss of appetite or trouble sleeping, as I just mentioned. Socially, isolation, anger, rejecting others, poor romantic choices, or peers. And sometimes when we are in a situation where we're experiencing grief, we might latch on to individuals that don't have our best interest, and that can definitely actually make the grief experience a lot worse because of the trauma that those relationships can bring to our already traumatic experience. Spiritually, we start questioning our faith in higher power. Sometimes people begin feeling angry at God for what has happened to them. So spiritually, that's an impact of a grief response. Emotionally, we're talking anxiety, depression, possibly suicidal thoughts, an exaggeration of mental health symptoms. So, say for instance, you already had a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or bipolar or ADHD, and now you had this grief experience. And so now whatever is happening with you already and a mental health challenge is increased because of this grief reaction, and that's an impact. And physical, social, spiritual, emotional, there are other aspects as well and beyond. There's just such a broad scope of how grief can manifest in a person if they don't get proper treatment and support and help. Now, we've talked about the types of grief, we've defined grief, we've looked at what is chronic grief, complicated grief, how it affects us socially and spiritually, and basically what the stages of grief are. Now, how do we go about moving from pain to purpose? First and foremost, step one, it's important to get a physical assessment. Start by making an appointment with your medical provider for complete assessment. During the process, it is likely you neglected your health, or you may have a burgeoning medical concern that warrants attention. If you're experiencing depression or anxiety symptoms, discuss that with your medical provider as well. It is so important because a lot of times when we're going through a grief experience, we neglect our health. While we're isolating ourselves, we're also not keeping our medical appointments. If we're women, we're not doing our mammograms or our pap smears, we're not getting our annual checkups. We are neglecting those important things. And if our body is already being compromised by this emotional state that we're in, then that's like a dual-edged sword in terms of our physical health. The second step is take a social assessment. Examine your social circles. Are you involved with the right person for you? Are you in a toxic relationship? Are your friends encouraging you or enabling you to stay or remain stuck in that grieving pattern? Now, take that in for a second, because sometimes well-meaning individuals, they come in our life during that phase that we're grieving. And if you're lucky, they're nurturing and they're helping you and they're supporting you and they're being sensitive to your grief and your challenge. However, be very careful that they don't impede the process so much, because they're coddling you so much that they're keeping you from being challenged to move forward. Is distance needed for you to move forward in a healthy manner? Now, does that mean leave your friends and reject everybody? Absolutely not. But what I am saying is that if they're toxic relationships, and yes, distance is warranted. However, if they're well-meaning folks, maybe this is a time for you to exercise some advocacy for yourself and say, hey, I think I'm doing well enough. I think I need to be challenged a little bit more. I appreciate your support, but I'm going to do some more things on my own. This is the time to try to move out of your comfort zone and into a new pattern that will allow you the opportunity to make new friends and expand your social support network. Step 3, spiritual assessment. And this is so important. Reconnect with your spirituality. Participating in spiritually based activities will encourage your healing. This not only includes church attendance, but meditation, yoga, spiritual retreats, self-care, walks in the park, and definitely unplugging from social media. This is the time to connect with the inner me, the healthy me, the newer me, and the person that wants to be the healed me. Always remember that. Moving from pain to purpose. Step 4, emotional and mental assessment. Be sure to evaluate your your emotional status. Are you feeling lost, hopelessness, or depressive thoughts daily? Have you noticed a significant change in your sleeping patterns? Have you lost interest in activities that used to bring you joy? Do you have thoughts of self-harm? Scheduling an appointment with a mental health therapist is a great first step in this assessment. The opportunity to explore your emotions and connect to the possibility of hope is vital to moving forward. And I love this part. This is the Pain to Purpose acronym by yours truly, Dr. Sarah Williams. And essentially, it is finding your purpose. So PURPOSE. And what that stands for is position yourself for your best life. Unite with like-minded individuals. Reward yourself for small accomplishments. Positive affirming activities such as Empowering Her Weekend. Oppose anything that interferes with your healing. Seek spiritual guidance in all things. Explore, engage, and employ all resources needed to move forward from pain to purpose. And I have been so delighted to offer you this webinar. I provided you with some online resources. My favorite books are TRY, Try Again, Transform and Renew Yourself by Dr. Shannon Tucker Harrington, and The Making of a Soldier, which is an inspiring story by Adrian S. Odom. You can catch my show, Dr. Sarah After Dark, which is a mental health awareness television program. Comes on Mondays at 5 p.m. with the nownetwork.org at 12 p.m. on Channel 4. And you can always do the Empowering Her Weekend that I'm sure 2020 is going to be a blast. If you need to schedule an appointment with a therapist, you can schedule with me. That's my contact information, or my counseling intern. We have a women's stress management group that meets each week, and you can contact 757-606-0971 to schedule time, or you can go to our email address and send us a request. I have some online assessments if you'd like to do a self-assessment to just kind of figure out where you are. And just remember, you can move forward from pain to purpose. And as you locate those resources, also, I wanted to mention that I will be available to answer some questions. This is a recorded audio but you are more than welcome to send any questions that you have to my email address, and I'll be happy to respond to you. Thank you so much.